All right, so we're going to get a lot more in depth here. This is kind of where we're going to stop and take a little more time, because this is where we're going to get into the rules, the requirements. How in the world do we qualify for that first time abate? And I keep referring to it as first time abate. You'll notice that, which is a subtle change. They went through and they revamped entirely this whole section of the Internal Revenue Manual that deals with this. They did that in November of 2017. They did it some more revision to the Internal Revenue Manual in March of 2018. So this is new revisions and new stuff that's happened. So first of all, that first time abate, we talked about it being an administrative type of a penalty relief. It's one of our favorite ones because you qualify, you get it. There's really not any other struggle. You don't even have to say what happened. It's just they qualify. So how in the world does one qualify? First of all, it's only for 3 penalty types that qualify. So we have the Internal Revenue Manual reference here. If you have any old information that refers to this, be aware that it did change Internal Revenue reference numbers. Where that is in the manual has changed because of all these new revisions. So the 3 types available for first-time abate, if it's anything other than these, it's just not available. That's a question I get sometimes. Well, I had somebody that, failed to file an information return, 1099. They failed to file a W-2. Well, unfortunately, that has a different penalty code section, so those particular ones aren't going to work. So it's a very specific type of failure to file and failure to pay. So it's normally just on tax returns. So could be a partnership, a corporation, individual tax return, failing to file, failing to pay, or failing to deposit. That's the 3 types that will actually be eligible. So what are some examples of that? Let's say somebody files their individual tax return on time. They file it maybe way ahead of the deadline. Let's say it was the end of February, but they owed and they didn't ever get around to paying by April 15th. Then in that case, they filed on time, but they still have a failure to pay because they didn't pay by April 15th. That's one type that could be eligible. They happen to file late, and they make a payment at the same time they file late, then they're going to get both. Or they file late, make no payment at all. Again, it's still a failure to file, failure to pay. What if they don't file at all? And they get a substitute for return. That's what that little note, SFR, means, substitute for return. The IRS takes information that they can find for a taxpayer on file and prepares a return for them. Well, then they go ahead and at that moment assess a failure to file and a failure to pay. They go ahead and assess those penalties. So technically, those are also eligible is if there's an SFR. There's cases where maybe they paid everything and filed everything on time, but they get audited down the road, and additional tax assessed can have some of these as well. So there's different circumstances that can be brought about, but it's just those 3 types that qualify. So if you look at them and, okay, yeah, I see that they qualify. These are within that particular type of penalty. What exactly is really at heart first-time abatement? It is a one-time option. It's kind of like one time in the lifetime of that taxpayer. And here's where it did have a little bit of change. We used to be able to call every few years and get a first-time abatement for an individual taxpayer. They were already pretty strict, I found, with corporations and partnerships. But for an individual taxpayer, you could call for 1 year and then call for a year that's 7 or 8 years later. It doesn't matter. It worked. However, they changed that. This is one of the major changes is now it's one time on that taxpayer's file or record for life. So you can do it for the corporation, you could do it for the partnership, you can do it for the individual, but only one time in that, entity's existence. So we always want to pursue other options first. That's kind of what I hinted at before in the RCA discussion is maybe I have a really good reason this happened and I want to argue reasonable cause. That little RCA assistant is going to be searching for first-time abatements before looking for what our reasonable cause is. So that's where it's a little difficult. There is also some discussion that there's programming being put in there where it will just automatically go through and award a first-time abatement on a penalty without us maybe having that discretion to determine which penalty we want. So I'm really hoping that doesn't come to fruition because that really goes against what I would want to do for my taxpayers. I want to get them the best one and not just whichever one that it assigns. So what are the requirements? Again, some newer changes that did come about. It was pretty open in the past. They would say whatever year. There never really was anything very distinct in the Internal Revenue Manual, but now they've changed it. It's only for tax periods 2001 or after, or specifically in the IRM it says tax periods after December 31st of 2000. So anything beginning in 2001 and after. Those are the ones that are eligible. But that's still a very wide window for us. That's 17, 18 years worth. So there could be a really great penalty that exists way back in time. Don't be afraid to go look for it. So they are very specific for the time frame. They're very specific for what penalties are eligible. But they also have to be in compliance, meaning they filed all the required returns. They are not going to give a reward for good behavior type of a penalty abatement for somebody that is not in compliance and has not filed all the returns that are supposed to be filed. So if they've done an extension for 2017 and they're still within the extension window, that's not a required return yet if they haven't filed it, but all those other ones would be required. So make sure they're in compliance. If they owe money, they have to have an arranged payment. I had a gentleman contact me and say, I'm having trouble with the first-time abatement. We talked about it a little bit, and they owed money. And I said, well, what kind of arrangement did they make? He said, well, they didn't make an arrangement yet. Well, that's not being able to cross off one of your items of eligibility. They have to have an installment agreement or an extension of time request does qualify as a payment arrangement. Be wary of the extension of time, though, because that is a true promise to pay. It's not just like giving you a little bit of a grace period. That is saying, I will have this paid as a taxpayer within the next 120 days. But, don't be afraid of that either. It can be a great technique. I've had an occasion where I knew that my taxpayer only owed the penalty, and we were very sure that, if we requested this, we thought, hey, we had a really great chance of getting that penalty abated. We went ahead and made that promise of time to pay 120 days, and then we have that set and we could check it off the list and we go back and get that first time abate because we knew at that moment then we qualified. And again, if you qualify for this one, you get it. It's administrative. All you have to do is qualify. And if there's not a balance owing, okay, maybe you have a taxpayer that doesn't owe anything. The trick here is, have they made any payments against any balances in the past 2 years? If they haven't made any payments against any balances in the past 2 years, don't request this yet because there isn't anything that's going to be able to be refunded. That's what RSED means, is refund statute expiration date. You have to have made payments in the past 2 years in order to have a refund eligible. So make sure there's enough of that RSED available to cover any of this penalty you're requesting back. So that can kind of blow a client away, right? They've paid everything, they're at zero balance, and you say, well, would you mind if I, asked for this penalty back? And then, they get a refund for this? It really just surprises them so much. But a technique is, if they don't have any balance owing and they have no refund available, is look to saving that kind of in your back pocket for a future year. Maybe next year they have a refund that's coming to them, in the sense of that they make a balance payment. So the technique there would be, you make sure that they are able to pay in enough, and it can't be done with withholding, by the way. It has to be done with a payment. So if maybe they owe at the end of the year enough to cover what that penalty abatement would be, then that's some possible technique. It's just something to think about there. The next thing that makes you eligible is 3 years prior to that penalty must be clean. So what do I mean by that? Let's say you're going to request a penalty abatement for that 2001 year. That means 2000, 1999, and 1998 can have no failure to file, failure to pay, failure to deposit. They can have zero. They can't have any of that penalty existing, or you just don't qualify. The idea of it being kind of a reward for good behavior is that you have to prove that you are behaving well as a taxpayer. You're not getting hit with these penalties for 3 whole years prior to the date you're asking for. So that's the idea of that. And it used to be, this is another change that was a little bit you could have, but now they changed the rule in the Internal Revenue Manual to be 0, literally 0, 0, 0. So it cannot have any failure to file or failure to pay or failure to deposit. Any of the penalties you're trying to get a first-time abate on, they have to be 0 in the 3 years prior. And now, because we know it's a one-time in the lifetime of the taxpayer option, we kind of have to be a little more we have to pay attention to the fact of maybe this person already got a first-time abatement sometime in their lifetime. So that's a little harder to check for if you're not looking through each of the different years and looking at transcripts. But that's something we have to at least have on our radar, is that even if you say, well, wait, I know I qualify. Every one of these I've checked off and they qualify. That would be the one I guess one thing that disqualifies you that you just didn't see coming, as they already got a first-time abatement sometime in their lifetime. So that's a little tougher to check for. How do we go about looking at all these? So how am I going to make sure that on those other screens that I've met all those qualifiers before I even call? And we've mentioned that I make sure and do my homework first, and I certainly recommend that you do. You're going to go through and say, how do I find this information? It all comes down to the transcripts. In those transcripts, you're going to be able to tell if they're in compliance, if they've had any penalties in the 3 prior years, how much they're having in penalties to get the best bang for their buck, how much in refund statutes. All these questions are able to be answered within the transcripts. Taxpayers are able to access their own. Others can. Pretty much a lot of people can get these transcripts. Anybody enrolled in IRS e-services can pull them using just an 8821 that the taxpayer signs. Now, you still have to fax that to the CAF unit. They still have to enter it. It's about a 2-week delay that I found in most cases. Anybody can pull that using just the 8821 if they're set up for e-services. However, if you're a Circular 230 practitioner, so an enrolled agent, a CPA, an attorney, you can pull that with that 8821 information request or a power of attorney, 2848. But the power of attorney, that basically has to be a Circular 230 practitioner. What I like to do when I'm looking at compliance and just getting a general picture for my taxpayer, I go way back in time, and you're going to go, wait a second, you just said that you can only do from 2001 forward. That's exactly correct, but maybe I want to see what kind of compliance this taxpayer's had. Because maybe I'm going to argue instead of the first-time abatement, I'm going to argue reasonable cause. And I can tell the agent, you know what, I've checked and I can see going way back to 1990, this taxpayer has been stellar. They have filed and paid their tax every single year on time, but here is the one occasion where, this happened to them and this is why they weren't able to comply. But my recommendation, if you don't want to go way back in time like what I do, you're going to want at least 1998 at that level. And you say, well, wait a second, you just said 2001 forward for a penalty of abatement on the first time abatement. That's correct. But if you don't have the 3 prior years listed for your power of attorney or your 8821, you're not going to be able to check and see if they have the 3 years clean. And if it's not listed on the power of attorney, they aren't going to be able to work with you on that. So that's just some recommendation for dates. Another little tidbit for you is, even though taxpayers can pull their own transcripts, they can call up and they can get transcripts, there is a limitation on that, interestingly enough. So we can go back to 1990 if we wish, but a taxpayer can only go back 10 years. So at this point, 2007, I think, is maybe the oldest year they can get. 2008 is going to be right around the corner. So they don't get as much information, and they may not get the benefit if the last 10 years don't qualify. Maybe there's a great one 15 or 16 years ago that is the one you want to go for. So that's just some thoughts as far as how that works. And if you're calling up, you can also have limitations as well. If you're calling and pulling transcripts for a husband and a wife, you're limited to 10. So you may get 5 years for the husband and 5 years for the wife, then hang up and call back again and get 5 more years for each, etc., all the way through. So it takes a little bit longer to get those. I'm always a great proponent of IRS e-services just because it's so much easier. The secondary little tidbit for that, and then we'll move on to the next thought, is when you're pulling that through IRS e-services, it doesn't really wake up the IRS per se. They don't know that you're pulling that information electronically. When you call an agent, they do know you're asking for that information, and they can ask for other things like, okay, we want X, Y, and Z by this date, by that date. It's going to wake them up if you call up. So that's just some thoughts for you.